The red taillights of the truck dwindled, then vanished into the swirling white chaos. Gone. My stepson Leo had actually done it. He'd left me stranded in the heart of a blizzard to die. The icy wind wasn't just cold. It felt like his hatred, sharp and biting, clawing at my exposed skin, stealing the breath from my lungs. For a horrifying moment, despair threatened to consume me. This was it. This was how he'd win. How my story would just end. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. But then a flicker. A stubborn, defiant spark ignited deep inside. A tiny ember refusing to be snuffed out by the gale. Leo saw me as his father's wife, an inconvenience he clearly wanted to remove. He never bothered to look deeper to see the woman I truly was. He never knew about my grandfather, about the harsh winters we'd faced together in the wild, about the skills that were now, quite literally, my only lifeline. He thought he was leaving a victim weak and easily discarded in the snow. He had no idea he'd just unleashed a survivor. And that, I swore to the howling wind that already tasted of ice and fury, would be his most profound, his most regrettable mistake. The wind howled back, but for the first time I heard a challenge in its voice, not just a threat. My life before Mark and Leo, and certainly before that day, had a comforting rhythm. I'm Sarah, and looking back, those earlier years feel like a lifetime ago. As a woman who had finally found her footing in a career I loved, meeting Mark felt like finding a missing piece of myself. He was a widower, kind and gentle, with a quiet sadness in his eyes that I'd yearned to soothe from the moment we met. Our connection was immediate, a deep understanding that blossomed into love. Marrying him was the easiest decision I'd ever made. He also had a teenage son, Leo. From the very start, I knew being a stepmother wouldn't be a simple path, especially to a boy who had lost his own mother at a young age. I genuinely wanted to bridge the gap, to earn his trust, if not his affection. I poured my heart into creating a warm, stable home. I learned to cook Leo's favorite meals, even the complicated ones. I'd feign genuine interest in his complex video games, asking questions I hoped sounded intelligent. I tried to give him space when he seemed to need it, while always letting him know I was there, a steady presence. Mark was my rock through it all, always appreciative of my efforts, always telling me how much he loved my patience and warmth. Our love felt like a sturdy shelter against any storm the world might throw at us. Most days, life was filled with the quiet hum of a contented family, or so I desperately wanted to believe. We lived in a comfortable house in a quiet suburb, the kind with trees lining the streets and kids riding bikes in the summer. It was the picture of normal I'd always hoped for. But I carried a part of me that most people, including Mark and Leo, didn't know about. It was a legacy from my grandfather, a rugged, wise man who always smelled faintly of pine needles and wood smoke. He hadn't just raised me on stories of the wilderness, he'd immersed me in it. He taught me practical skills, things most people in my suburban life would never imagine needing. How to read the subtle shifts in the weather from the clouds, how to find or build shelter with minimal resources, how to coax a fire to life in the dampest, most unwelcoming conditions. Every winter, without fail, we'd go on short, challenging treks into the backcountry. He called it respecting the teeth of the cold, a way to understand nature's power and our own resilience. It became my quiet passion, a secret source of strength, a way to connect with nature and with his enduring memory after he passed. I never broadcasted these skills. It was my personal sanctuary, a skill set I fervently hoped I'd never need in a life or death way, but one that brought me a deep, unshakable sense of capability and inner peace. To Mark and Leo, I was just Sarah, the loving wife, the stepmom who tried perhaps a little too hard sometimes. They had no idea about the part of me that knew how to listen to the profound silence of a frozen forest and understand its hidden language, its warnings, and its opportunities. The first tiny crack in our carefully constructed family picture appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly, a faint tremor beneath the surface of our daily lives. It was a few months after Mark, in a moment of wanting to secure my future and ensure I was taken care of, updated his will. He explained it to Leo patiently, emphasizing that it was about fairness, about looking after everyone he loved, not about replacing anyone. Leo, then 16, had just nodded, his expression unreadable, his eyes veiled. But I felt something shift in him after that day. His surface-level politeness became tinged with a new, cool reserve that pricked at my unease. Little comments started, so slight, so easily dismissed, that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. If I bought a new dress for a work event, he'd mutter something just under his breath about me spending Dad's money. If Mark praised something I did, a new recipe I tried, or a success at my job, Leo's smile wouldn't quite reach his eyes. It was a fleeting, tight-lipped imitation. He started conveniently forgetting to pass on important messages from Mark, or accidentally spilling coffee on my important papers just before a deadline. Each incident was small enough to be plausibly deniable, to make me feel like I was overreacting, being too sensitive if I even thought of bringing it up. It was insidious. When I tried to talk to Mark about it, gently at first, not wanting to cause friction, he'd frown, a troubled look momentarily crossing his face. He'd usually sigh and say Leo was just a teenager. He's still grieving his mom, he'd explain in his own way. He doesn't mean any harm. I understood Mark's deep-seated need to protect his son, to believe the absolute best of him, especially after the loss they'd both endured. But a knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach, a persistent, uncomfortable feeling. Leo was disturbingly adept at playing the innocent, his face a mask of wide-eyed apology if I ever did gently confront him about a specific action. He'd be so sorry, Sarah, he's just so clumsy, he'd claim with an expression that, to me, looked more like a carefully concealed smirk than genuine remorse. The air in our home, once filled with a tentative, hopeful warmth, began to carry a distinct chill that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. I started to feel like I was walking on eggshells around him, constantly second-guessing my own perceptions. Was I being too sensitive? Or was there something more calculated, more malevolent, brewing beneath Leo's carefully cultivated teenage angst? A lingering question mark hung over our household. Those small, unsettling disturbances soon began to feel less like random accidents and more like a deliberate, strategic campaign. Leo became a master of passive aggression, his tactics subtle yet designed to wound. He'd leave articles open on the family computer, always angled so I couldn't miss them, about scheming stepmothers or gold digging new spouses. He'd conveniently lose things that were important to me. A sentimental piece of jewelry my grandmother had given me, research notes for a project I was passionate about at work. They'd usually turn up later, in the most bizarre places, but only after I'd spent frantic hours searching, my anxiety mounting. He'd then offer a bland, "Oh, was that what you were looking for?" His eyes, though, held a glint of something knowing, something deeply satisfied that sent shivers down my spine. He started subtly poisoning Mark against me, twisting my words, reframing my intentions. If I expressed a mild, responsible concern about our household finances, planning for the future, Leo would later tell Mark, with faint concern, that Sarah seemed really stressed about money, Dad. She was saying we spend too much. If I suggested a quiet weekend at home because I was tired from a long week, it became, Sarah doesn't seem to like it when your friends come over, Dad. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Mark, already predisposed to believe his son, the child he had raised alone for so many years, started to look at me with a hint of doubt in his eyes sometimes. It was heartbreaking to see that subtle shift, that erosion of trust. Our conversations, once easy and open, became more strained, more cautious. The cabin Mark had inherited from his parents, a rustic, charming place nestled deep in the mountains, became a frequent topic of discussion. Mark loved that cabin. It held so many childhood memories for him. He wanted to fix it up, maybe use it for family getaways eventually, or perhaps sell it if the upkeep became too much. During one such discussion about planning a trip to check on it, Leo made a comment that sent an icy tendril of fear down my spine. He said it was pretty remote up there, wasn't it? He looked directly at me then, a strange, unsettling intensity in his gaze. Someone could get seriously lost, he continued, his voice casual, too casual. No cell service. No one around for miles. He laughed it off as just a random observation, but the way he said it, the directness of his stare, it felt like a veiled threat, a dark seed planted. I tried to voice my growing concerns to Mark more directly, my desperation mounting. I told him, Mark, I'm worried about Leo. His behavior. It's not normal teenage stuff anymore. I feel like he's deliberately trying to undermine me to cause trouble between us." Mark sighed then, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of his own frustration. He pleaded, "Sarah, please. He's just testing boundaries. He's a good kid at heart. He wouldn't intentionally hurt anyone." But I wasn't so sure anymore. The unease had morphed into a genuine creeping fear that coiled in my stomach. I felt increasingly isolated, as if I were the only one seeing the darkness coiling beneath Leo's carefully crafted facade of youthful innocence. I started sleeping a little less soundly, a heavy sense of foreboding settling over me like a damp, suffocating cloak. Something bad was coming. I could feel it in my bones. The situation reached a critical, undeniable point when Mark had a minor health scare. He needed a small, routine surgery, nothing life-threatening, the doctors assured us, but it meant a few weeks of recovery where he'd need to take it very easy, no stress, no exertion. Suddenly, almost overnight, Leo transformed. He became the model of a concerned, dutiful son. He offered to help out more around the house, to run all the errands, to support me in every way while Mark was recuperating. He told us both, his voice thick with earnestness, "Don't worry, Sarah. Dad, I'll take care of everything." His sudden, overwhelming helpfulness felt wrong. It was too perfect, too abrupt a change, entirely out of character with his behavior over the past year. A tiny alarm bell went off deep in my head, a faint warning siren, but I tried to silence it. I told myself perhaps this was a turning point, maybe he was finally maturing, realizing the importance of family. Mark, of course, was deeply touched by Leo's apparent change of heart, his eyes shining with pride. A week before Mark's scheduled surgery, Leo made a suggestion. "Dad," he began, "remember you wanted to check on the cabin before winter really sets in? Make sure the pipes are drained, secure the shutters against the snow?" He paused, then added, "Sarah and I could go up for the day. Get it done so you don't have to worry about it while you're recovering." It sounded perfectly reasonable on the surface. A thoughtful gesture. Mark thought it was a great idea, another sign of Leo stepping up, taking responsibility. I, however, felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach, cold and heavy. The cabin. The remote, isolated cabin. Leo's earlier words about getting lost, about no cell service, echoed ominously in my mind. But how could I refuse without sounding paranoid, irrational, especially when Mark was looking at Leo with such open pride and relief? I forced a smile, my lips feeling stiff. I agreed. It seemed I had no other choice. The morning of the trip, the sky was a bruised, ominous gray. Snow was forecast, heavy snow. I voiced my concern, maybe we should postpone? My voice, I hoped, sounded casual, not anxious. Leo scoffed dismissively. "A little snow won't hurt us, Sarah," he insisted. "Besides, Dad wants this done." Mark, still in his pajamas and looking pale, kissed me goodbye at the door. He thanked us both for doing this and told us to be safe. His words felt heavy with an unintended, chilling irony. The drive started with Leo being unusually chatty, almost manic, a forced cheerfulness that grated on my nerves. Then, as we got further from the city and climbed higher into the mountains, he grew quiet, a tense, coiled energy radiating from him that made the air in the truck feel thick and suffocating. About an hour from the cabin, he suddenly, without warning, turned off the main highway onto a barely visible, unplowed logging road. My heart started to pound. "Leo, where are you going?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "This isn't the way to the cabin." He mumbled it was a shortcut. "Saw it on a map," he claimed. "Cuts off like 30 minutes. Plus," he added with a strange glint in his eye, "it's more scenic." Scenic? It was a claustrophobic tunnel of dense, snow-laden pines, the track barely discernible beneath a fresh layer of white. My protests grew louder, more insistent, but he just gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, his jaw set. Then, with a sickening lurch and a horrible, grinding metallic sound from beneath us, the truck shuddered violently and stopped. Dead. We were miles from anywhere, the snow now falling thick and fast, visibility dropping to near zero. "Oh no," Leo said, his voice laced with a theatrical panic that didn't fool me for a second. "It was too rehearsed. Looks like we're stuck. Engine's dead." He fumbled with the ignition, making a great show of trying to restart it, the engine only giving a pathetic dying whir. It was utterly futile and I knew he knew it. He announced then, a little too quickly, a little too brightly, I'll have to go for help. You stay here, stay warm. Before I could argue, before I could even process the full, horrifying extent of the situation, he was out of the truck. He rummaged in the back, grabbing the emergency kit Mark always kept there. He also snatched my phone, which had been charging on the dash, and crucially the truck keys. He said he'd be as quick as he could, his face a mask of false concern. Then he slammed the door, and with a final chilling glance back at me, a glance that held a flicker of something cold and undeniably triumphant, he started walking, quickly disappearing into the swirling snow down the track, in the direction away from the main road we'd left. He hadn't just taken the keys to the truck. He had, he believed, taken my lifeline. The silence that descended after Leo vanished was deafening, absolute, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind as it buffeted the truck and the frantic, painful thumping of my own heart against my ribs. For a few long, terrifying moments, pure, unadulterated terror held me captive, freezing me in place. I was trapped, miles from civilization, in a dying truck, with a blizzard raging around me and temperatures plummeting with alarming speed. He'd done it. He'd actually deliberately done it. He'd left me here to freeze to death. The sheer malice of it, the cold-blooded calculation behind his every action that day, struck me like a physical blow. Tears welled hot against my skin and then instantly icy on my cheeks. This was his plan all along. The suggestion for the cabin trip, the insistence on going despite the weather, the shortcut, the fake breakdown. It was all a meticulously crafted stage for my demise. Despair, heavy and suffocating, threatened to swallow me whole. I could just sit here, let the cold creep in, and give up. It would be easy. But then, through the thick fog of fear and disbelief, another voice whispered, faint but clear. My grandfather's voice, calm and steady as it had always been in my memories. He used to say, "The wild respects strength, Sarah, not surrender." Slowly, painstakingly, I pushed the rising panic down. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the frigid air searing my lungs. I assessed the situation. Analyzed the options. Survive. My training, dormant for so long, began to surface, muscle memory and ingrained knowledge kicking in with surprising clarity. First, shelter. The truck offered some temporary protection, but it would become an icebox quickly, a metal coffin. I needed something better, more sustainable. I scanned my surroundings through the snow-streaked windows. Dense pine forests surrounded us. Snowdrifts were already forming against the trees. Perfect. A snow cave, or at least a deep snow pit with a significant windbreak, would offer insulation. I checked my pockets, my fingers numb. My own phone, I remembered with a fresh wave of anger, was dead. Leo had accidentally unplugged it from its charger in the house that morning, I now realized with a sickening certainty. Another piece of his cruel plan. But my fingers brushed against something small and hard in my coat pocket. A cheap plastic lighter I'd forgotten was there from a summer camping trip, and the small, sturdy multi-tool Mark had given me years ago that I always carried in my purse and thankfully had moved to my coat for the trip. Not much, but it was something. A spark. A blade. Leo, in his arrogant haste to abandon me, had overlooked them. He'd taken the main emergency kit, confident it held everything of value, but he hadn't been thorough enough. His arrogance, I realized with a surge of cold clarity, was his first mistake. My gaze then fell upon something on the floor of the truck, half kicked under the passenger seat, almost hidden by shadow. A small, folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a roughly drawn map, clearly sketched by hand. Our current location, where the truck had broken down, was circled with a large, bold X. And leading away from it, in the opposite direction Leo had walked, another route was marked, a clearer, more direct path that seemed to lead back towards a secondary, maintained road. And scrawled at the bottom, in Leo's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Allow 2 hours for hike out. Report SAR her direction. SAR. Search and rescue." He wasn't just leaving me, he was planning to actively misdirect any help that might come looking. This wasn't just abandonment born of panic or teenage cruelty. It was premeditated, cold-blooded, attempted murder. A cold fury, pure and galvanizing, surged through me then, burning away the last vestiges of fear and despair. He wasn't just going to fail to kill me. He was going to pay for this. This map, this tiny damning piece of paper, was the proof I needed. I tucked it carefully inside my glove, a silent promise to myself. Fueled by adrenaline and a grim, unyielding determination, I got to work. The next few hours were a blur of focused, desperate activity. I found a large snowdrift against a cluster of thick pines and began to dig, using the multi-tool's small shovel attachment in my gloved hands. It was brutal, exhausting work, the wind tearing at me, but the cold rage inside me was a powerful furnace driving me on. As darkness began to fall, heavy and absolute, I had a cramped but serviceable snow cave, deep enough to insulate me from the worst of the wind and the dangerously dropping temperatures. I lined the floor with pine boughs for extra insulation. My water bottle was almost empty, but I knew how to melt snow safely, a little at a time. Food would be the biggest challenge, but survival wasn't about comfort. It was about endurance, one moment at a time. The storm raged outside my makeshift shelter, a symphony of fury, but inside my little snow haven, a grim sense of purpose settled over me. Leo thought he had written my ending. He had no idea I was just starting a new chapter, the one where I survived, and he faced the terrible consequences of his actions. The next few days were a testament to every lesson my grandfather had ever patiently taught me, every hardship he'd guided me through. Time blurred into a relentless cycle of conserving precious energy, melting snow for water using the lighter sparingly and the truck's empty plastic coolant bottle I'd retrieved, and meticulously rationing the single stale protein bar I found forgotten in the glove compartment of the truck. I reinforced my shelter each morning, ventured out only when absolutely necessary, always acutely aware of the dangers: hypothermia, disorientation in the whiteout conditions, the gnawing hunger. The cold was a constant, insidious enemy, but my layers of clothing, though not full Arctic gear, were decent. More importantly, my mind was clear, sharp, focused. The image of Leo's triumphant smirk as he walked away, the cold calculation evident in his handwritten note, burned in my memory, stoking the fires of my resolve. I wasn't just surviving for myself. I was surviving to see justice done, to unmask him. I knew vaguely from past conversations with Mark about the cabin that a rarely used ranger access trail was supposed to be about 5 miles east of where the main road should be, if my orientation was correct. If I could navigate through the dense, snow-choked woods, if the storm finally broke and gave me a chance, I might just have a way out. On the third day, the blizzard finally exhausted itself. The sky cleared to a brilliant, achingly icy blue. The world was blanketed in a pristine, deep layer of snow. It was breathtakingly beautiful and incredibly deadly. I knew I couldn't stay put indefinitely. My meager supplies wouldn't last much longer. Taking the multi-tool, the precious lighter, the incriminating map tucked safely away, and what remained of my water, I started my trek. Each step was an agonizing effort in the deep, yielding snow, but I moved with a slow, steady, determined rhythm. I used the sun's position and the lay of the land to navigate, just as my grandfather had shown me all those years ago. Hours later, utterly exhausted, profoundly dehydrated, but driven by an unquenchable will, I stumbled upon it, a faint indentation in the snow, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but undeniably the ranger trail I'd been hoping for. Hope, fierce and bright and almost painful, surged through me. I followed it, pushing my protesting body to its absolute limits. It felt like an eternity, each step a monumental victory, but then I saw it, a thin plume of wood smoke rising in the still, cold air in the distance. A ranger station. I almost collapsed with overwhelming relief. When I finally stumbled through their door, covered head to toe in snow, frost-nipped, and barely able to speak coherent words, the two rangers inside looked at me as if they'd seen a ghost emerge from the wilderness. Meanwhile, Leo, I later learned, had played his part to perfection. He'd made his way out as per his own little map and tearfully, dramatically reported me missing. He'd spun a convincing, heart-wrenching tale. I'd apparently become disoriented during a short walk from the truck while he was checking the engine, wandered off into the woods just as the storm hit its peak. He claimed he'd searched frantically for me, calling my name until he was hoarse, before being forced by the worsening conditions to seek help for himself to even have a chance of alerting anyone to my plight. He was the very picture of a distraught stepson, worried, sick, consumed by guilt and fear for my safety. Mark, my dear Mark, was beside himself with grief and self-reproach, organizing search parties with frantic energy, clinging to every shred of hope the initial searchers offered. Our friends and the local community rallied around him, offering sympathy and support to poor, brave Leo, who was bearing up so stoically under the strain. He was probably already imagining how he'd console his grieving father in the coming weeks, how he'd eventually respectfully inherit everything Mark owned. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it, that the wilderness had done his dirty work. He had no idea I was not only alive but also carried the tiny folded piece of paper that would unravel his entire charade, his entire life. I spent a full day recovering at the ranger station, wrapped in warm blankets, sipping hot tea and getting medical attention for minor frostbite on my fingers and toes, and severe dehydration. The authorities were contacted. I told them my story calmly and precisely, the words tumbling out now that I was safe. The incriminating map, slightly crumpled but legible, was handed over as evidence. Then it was time to go home. They arranged for a local police officer, a kind woman named Deputy Miller, to drive me. I didn't call Mark. I couldn't. I needed to see Leo's face when he realized his plan had failed so spectacularly. We pulled up to our house in the late afternoon. Several cars were parked outside. It seemed Leo was hosting a small gathering, perhaps a support session for a grieving Mark, or maybe he was already subtly laying the groundwork for his comfortable future. Deputy Miller said she would wait in the car but be ready. I nodded, took a deep breath and walked up to my own front door. I pushed it open. The living room was full. Mark was there, his face etched with a grief so profound it made him look 10 years older, his shoulders slumped. A few concerned neighbors were speaking to him in hushed tones, their faces somber. A couple of Mark's siblings stood by, looking lost. And there, in the center of it all, holding court, was Leo. He was in the middle of recounting his heroic efforts to find me, his voice thick with fake emotion, dabbing at his dry eyes. I stepped fully into the room. I said, my voice surprisingly strong and clear, cutting through his monologue, actually, Leo, your story has a few inaccuracies. Every head in the room turned. Time seemed to freeze, the air crackling with sudden tension. Leo's jaw dropped. His face, I will never forget it, went from feigned sorrow to stark white terror in a single horrifying split second. It was, without a doubt, the most deeply satisfying expression I had ever seen in my life. Mark gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief, then a dawning, ecstatic joy as he rushed towards me, tears now genuine and streaming down his face. Sarah, he cried out, his voice choked. Oh my God, Sarah. You're alive. He hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, burying his face in my hair. Over his shoulder I met Leo's panicked, trapped gaze. The game was up. He knew it. Once Mark had released me, his overwhelming joy quickly turning to utter confusion as he looked from my ragged appearance to a now visibly trembling Leo. I laid it all out. I recounted the drive, the suspicious shortcut, being deliberately abandoned in the blizzard. I described finding the map, his meticulously planned escape route for himself, his cruel instruction to misdirect any search for me. I pulled the crumpled map from my pocket and handed it to Mark. His face hardened as he read it, the color draining away completely, replaced by a look of utter horror and profound betrayal as he stared at his son, the son he had loved and defended. Leo, Mark whispered, his voice cracking with pain. What is this? Tell me this isn't true. Leo started to stammer, to deny, to babble incoherently, but the evidence was irrefutable. My survival, my presence there, was the ultimate proof of his monstrous deceit. The neighbors and family members looked on, aghast, their earlier sympathetic expressions towards Leo morphing into ones of shock and profound disgust. Deputy Miller, who had discreetly followed me in at the first sign of commotion, stepped forward. She addressed Leo, her voice firm and unwavering. Leo Thompson, she stated, you need to come with us. We have some questions for you regarding the attempted murder of Sarah Carmichael. Leo didn't resist. He didn't say another word. He just stood there, utterly deflated, his mask of innocence shattered, revealing the petty, malevolent coward beneath. Watching him being led away in handcuffs from my home, his head bowed in shame, was a moment of pure, unadulterated catharsis. The snow outside might have been cold, but justice, I found in that moment, had a satisfying, cleansing warmth all its own. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of police statements, legal proceedings, and emotional turmoil. Leo was charged with attempted murder and several other offenses, including endangerment. The evidence, including his handwritten note on the map and my detailed testimony of the events, was damning. He tried to plead it down, his lawyer attempting to claim it was a reckless prank gone horribly wrong, a moment of youthful stupidity, but no one was buying it. The premeditation was too clear, too chillingly obvious. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to a significant prison term. Seeing him in court during the sentencing, stripped of all his arrogance, looking small, scared, and pathetic, was the final nail in the coffin of his cruel charade. Mark was utterly devastated, broken in a way I hadn't thought possible. The betrayal by his own son, the child he had cherished, cut him to the very core. There was a period of immense strain on our marriage, not because of anything I had done or not done, but because of his own overwhelming guilt for not seeing Leo's true nature sooner, for not listening to my earlier concerns, for not protecting me, for, in his mind, enabling his son's insidious toxicity for so long. We started therapy both individually and as a couple. It was a long, hard road, littered with difficult conversations and painful realizations, but slowly, painstakingly, we began to heal, to rebuild the trust that Leo had tried so desperately and maliciously to destroy. Mark finally, fully understood the depth of his son's malice, and he stood firmly by my side, his love a comfort and a strength. Life now is different. It's quieter, more deliberate. The cabin, once a place that held the promise of future family memories, now held too many dark shadows, too many echoes of that terrible day. We sold it. I knew I could never bear to set foot there again. The experience changed me profoundly. I'm warier, perhaps more attuned to the subtle undercurrents in people, but I'm also undeniably stronger. I know with a certainty that both chills and empowers me in equal measure, exactly what I'm capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. Interestingly, my story, or parts of it, eventually got out, shared in hushed tones at first, then more openly within our community. A local women's support group asked me if I would consider speaking about resilience and overcoming adversity. That tentative step led to me cautiously starting to share my winter survival skills, teaching small workshops focusing on safety, preparedness, and empowerment in the outdoors. It felt incredibly good to turn something so horrific, so negative, into a source of strength and empowerment for others, and, in truth, for myself. Justice, in Leo's case, was served by the legal system. But my true revenge wasn't just seeing him punished. It was living, and living well. It was thriving, refusing to be a victim defined by his actions. It was in rebuilding my life, my marriage, and finding a new sense of purpose. It was in appreciating every sunrise, every warm cup of coffee, every moment of simple, quiet peace with a depth I never knew before. Leo tried to extinguish my light, to erase me. But he only succeeded in showing me how brightly that light could burn, even in the coldest, darkest, most terrifying night. And that, I reflect often as I look out at the changing seasons, is the most satisfying, the most complete victory of all.